In Genesis 1, 1 through 3, we find the following. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the earth. But then the Spirit of God swept across the face of the water, and God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. Now, there are lots of things to draw on from that passage and on which I could preach, but the one thing that I want to focus our attention on today is the fact that when God created the heavens and the earth, that creation proceeded from him. Specifically, it proceeded from his mouth. And this is important because the mouth of the Lord is the source of all life. When Moses told the children of Israel in Deuteronomy 8:3, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God, he was doing more than giving them a moral lesson about listening to God and obeying his commandments. No, he tied this admonition directly to the fact that God sustained their lives for 40 years in the desert by supplying them with manna from heaven. Reading Deuteronomy 8:3 in full, he humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Now, this is more significant than you might think at first blush. I mean, I certainly remember this text being taught in a sermon at the church where I grew up, and the preacher using this text to make the point that what Moses was saying here was that if the children of Israel had only heeded the words that proceeded from the mouth of the Lord and placed their trust in those words, there would have been no need for the 40 years sojourn in the desert in the first place, and thence no need for the manna. But the basic undertone in his sermon being that if you had done the work that God had given you to do, then you wouldn't have to rely on his welfare. Now, I'm not saying that lesson has no merit. I mean, we do see in chapter 47 of the book of Genesis that the children of Israel relinquished the ownership of their land, their cattle, their possessions, and finally even their own bodies to the government of Egypt in exchange for food rations. And by the time God sends Moses to rescue them out of the hands of Pharaoh, they had a mentality thoroughly ingrained within them that they were to work for the government and the government was supposed to provide their needs. And as a result, they were so steeped in the day-to-day drudgery of just getting by, just to eat, that they had no capacity for handling anything more than their daily rations. So when God showed them the land that he had given them for their inheritance and told them, "I'm giving this into your hands. All you need to do is go and take possession of it," the people said, "No, that's all right. That's far too daunting a task for us. We'd much rather just go back to Egypt and go back on the dole." And they were so entrenched in that framework of thinking that if Jesus had appeared to them at that time and had taught them, say, the parable of the unjust steward, as it is presented to us in Luke 16, they wouldn't have had any frame of reference for what he said in verses 10 through 12 of that passage, where he said, "Anyone who's trustworthy in little things is trustworthy in great. Anyone who's dishonest in little things is dishonest in great. If then you are not trustworthy with unrighteous mammon, who will trust you with genuine riches? And if you're not trustworthy with what is not yours, who will give you what is your very own?" Because the idea of ownership, along with the responsibilities of ownership, was completely lost on them. Because the whole sense of the economy of life had been thrown out of whack. So God had a lot of remedial work to do with the Israelites. And he had to start with the basics, the most basic, of basics by reminding them day after day for 40 years that everything comes from God. He was the one who appeared to Abraham at Haran and said, "Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show you." That is, he said to Abraham from the get-go, I'm inviting you to stop depending on Terah, your father, and start depending on me. And Abraham quite apparently got that, because according to Genesis 12:5, he didn't just get up and go, putting himself at risk to follow God. No, he put everything on the line, himself, his substance, and every soul in his household. And if you get the chance, go and look up Genesis 12:5 in an interlinear Septuagint sometime, the Greek Old Testament. And you'll see that in that passage, in that verse, are the words that are translated substance and soul there are huperkanta and suke, the same two words that I've talked about so much over the last several weeks. But I've tried to help us get a better understanding of the fact that a person's substance, a person's huperkanta, is more than just his or her property. It's a property of their suke, a property of their whole being, body and spirit. And why did Abraham go, soul and substance, to take possession of his inheritance? Because the mouth of the Lord had spoken it, and he believed that it would come to pass. And he understood that what proceeds from the mouth of the Lord is more than simply words, more than simply information. He understood that the very creation itself proceeded from the mouth of the Lord. The Lord spoke, and it was. And he understood that that was so for every part of creation, including man, including humankind, including Adam. But that isn't all there was to it. It wasn't just that the Lord spoke and the earth came into existence. It wasn't just that the Lord spoke and Adam came into existence. The events of the creation, as they're presented to us in Genesis 1 and 2, are bracketed by two events of great significance. In the first event, when God created the heavens and the earth was void and formless until it was inhabited by the Spirit of God. All there was earth and water, which is not enough on its own to make life. No, in order to make life, you need earth, water, air, and energy. And in Genesis 1:2, God provided those other two basic components, because the light-bearing Spirit of God, the energy-emitting pneuma of God, swept across the face of the waters, and the Lord said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Before then, the earth had no chance at life. But when God inhabited the earth came to life. It was filled with light-emitting energy, bringing the soil and the water to life. And in Genesis 2:7, we learned that the same process was at play when God created humankind. But then the Lord God fashioned a creature of dust from the soil of the earth, and when he breathed the breath of life into its nostrils, the dust thing became a living soul. All that we are and all that we have comes from God and is sustained by God. God is the maker and sustainer of all things. As Paul said to the Athenians in Acts 17:28, "For it is in him that we live and move and have our being." And as we read in Job 34:14-15, if God were ever to resolve to withdraw his spirit from the universe, beckoning the breath of life to return to him, then every living thing would die in an instant, and humankind would return to dust. And this knowledge, this wisdom, has been at the center of the Hebrew faith and understanding, at least since the days of Abraham and Job. As the ancient Hebrew prayer, the Shehecheyanu, says, "Praise be our God, ruler of the universe. Praised be our God, ruler of the world, for giving us life, sustaining us, and for enabling us to reach this day." You see, Abraham knew, he understood that the promise that God was making to him when he called him to faith was more than simply a spiritual promise. No, it involved his whole being, his soul, body, and spirit, and the soul, the whole being of everyone in his household, and all of his substance, all of his huperconta, all the stuff that helped to make up who he was and what he was. And he came to understand that, at least in part, when he learned that God, too, was committed to the proposition of dedicating his whole being, his whole substance, to his covenant with Abraham as well. That's the significance of the transaction that we read about in Genesis 15, 8 through 17. But Abram said, "Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of the land?" So the Lord said to him, "Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon." Abram brought all these things to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure." Then, when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, there appeared a smoldering furnace purling with smoke, and a blazing firebrand, which passed between the carcass halves. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, "To your descendants I give this land." Now, I've told you this before, but for those who don't know, this is a ceremony that has significance of binding meaning. In the ancient Near East, when a covenant was being made between two parties, when an oath was being sworn out, it was usual for an appeal to be made to some kind of authority who could bring pressure to bear on the parties of the covenant to compel them to keep their word. However, in the case of a covenant between kings, who in many ancient cultures were thought of as gods, people knew of no higher authority to appeal to in order to guarantee the covenant. So what they would do is swear by themselves. And the way that they would do that was by doing exactly what's described here in Genesis 15. They would set out carcass halves and then pass between the carcasses, signifying that the authority by which they were ratifying this covenant was the authority that had the power of being within itself, the authority of whatever God or force or fate or cosmic will that had given them the power to exist as kings. And when they passed between the carcass halves, what they were saying by that act was, if I don't keep my word, may I be rent asunder, just as these animals have been rent asunder. If I don't keep my word, may I cease to exist as the being I have been empowered to be. May I be done away in sum and substance. And that's exactly what God was saying to Abraham in Genesis 15:17. May I be rent asunder. May I cease to have the power of being within myself. May I be extinguished as Yahweh. May the I am not be if I fail to keep my word to you. I swear to you on my very existence, on my very substance, that I will keep my word to you. And this is where we start to get into the heart of today's lesson. Because when God makes his covenant with Abraham, we begin to see God drawing near to humankind and inhabiting his creation in a way that he had not done since the fall. I mean, after the fall, God did not withdraw his spirit entirely from creation. We've already discussed that. But he did withdraw his spirit to the extent that the creation became subject to entropy in a way that it had not been subject to entropy prior to the fall. When Adam reached out his hand and plucked the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and ate of it, he didn't just change himself, but he changed the whole creation. As I mentioned in my lesson 2 weeks ago, Paul tells us in Romans 8:19 through 20, for the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to entropy, not by its own choice, but by the willful act of the one who subjected it. And Paul makes it clear 3 chapters earlier in the book of Romans that the one who subjected the creation to entropy was Adam. That is, the earth and all that it contains became unrighteous mammon when Adam sinned. And as I understand the matter, that didn't happen just by divine decree, but also, more importantly for today's lesson, because when Adam sinned, God recoiled from that sin and withdrew his presence. Not entirely, otherwise the creation would have ceased to be. But he did withdraw, at least to the extent that he no longer had fellowship with Adam and Eve as he had once had with them in the garden. And he no longer infused the creation with the kind of divine order that had once infused, that he had once infused it with. When, for instance, in Genesis 1, he set the sun and the moon and the stars in place and set everything in creation in order. That's why, as I understand the matter, the average lifespan of human beings began to decrease over time, and why sin increased over the face of the earth to such a degree that God determined that the earth must be destroyed in the flood by declaring in Genesis 6:3, my spirit must not be at odds with humankind forever. But after the flood, God began to re-engage with humankind. And the first evidence we see of this is in his interactions with Abraham. Because first, God draws near to Abraham to draw Abraham away from the world and toward him. And second, and more importantly for today's lesson, when Abraham asks God to give him evidence that he will indeed keep his covenant with him, when Abraham asks for evidence that he is not abandoning his people and his way of life for naught, God offers him proof by blessing Abraham with his presence in a vulnerable and tactile way. He commanded Abraham to create a space for him. And then he himself came and inhabited that space. Now, to be sure, the space that Abraham created was not an enclosed space. It was an open air space. But it was a physical space defined by the carcass halves that he had laid out and the area between them. And this is the beginning of a progression that we see of God inhabiting physical spaces in a real and perceptible way as he works his way toward creating a permanent and lasting relationship with humankind, which relationship is always at its best when it involves physical closeness, physical proximity. That's why, as I understand the matter, God commanded Moses to build the tabernacle, to build the tent of meeting when he made his covenant with the children of Israel through Moses, because he wanted to dwell among his people. As God said to Moses in Exodus 25:8, and let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. And again in Exodus 26:43 through 46, and there I will meet the children of Israel, and the tabernacle shall be sanctified by my glory, and I will sanctify the tabernacle of the congregation and the altar. I will sanctify also Aaron and his sons to minister to me in the priest's office, and I will dwell among the children of Israel and will be their God, and they shall know that I am the Lord their God that brought them forth out of the land of Egypt, that I may dwell among them. For I am the Lord their God. God wanted Moses to build the tabernacle, sometimes referred to as the tent of meeting, though there was also another tent where Moses met with God outside the camp that was also sometimes referred to as the tent of meeting. Nevertheless, God wanted Moses to build the tabernacle for him precisely because he wanted to dwell in the midst of his people. He wanted to be close to them, physically close to them. And he was physically close to them, as we read in Exodus 40:33 through 35. And so Moses finished the work of setting up the tabernacle as the Lord had commanded him. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. God established his tabernacle in the midst of the people, and it was in the very center of their encampment, with 3 of the tribes of Israel camped to the north of it. That's north, right? 3 to the south, 3 to the east, 3 to the west, which, as a side note, many Bible scholars believe would have made the encampment of the Israelites from the air look like a cross, which, if that was God's intention, would have made the children of Israel, as they wandered in the desert, an embodiment, a foreshadowing of the coming of Christ, with the Lord at the center of the camp. But the whole idea of the cruciform encampment notwithstanding, it remains evident not only that God wanted to be physically close to his people, but that they wanted to be physically close to him as well. Now, to be sure, they didn't want to be too close to God because they were afraid of him. As we read in Exodus 20:18 through 21, in regard to Moses ascending the mountain to receive the law from God, when the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we'll listen. But do not have God speak to us, or we will die." Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid. God has come to test you, so that the fear of God will be with you and keep you from sinning." But the people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. And as we read also in Exodus 34:29 through 31, when Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the covenant law in his hands, he was not aware that his face was emitting light, because he had spoken with the Lord. When Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, his face was emitting light, and they were afraid to come near him. But Moses called to them, so Aaron and all the leaders of the community came back to him and spoke to them. So they were afraid, but even so, it appears that over the course of the next year or so, as the tabernacle was being constructed, the people began to appreciate the benefit of having God close at hand. And even though it frightened them to have God and his tabernacle in their midst, They kept the tabernacle in the middle of the camp throughout their sojourn in the desert, as we read in Numbers 9:15-23. On the day the tabernacle, the tent of the covenant law, was set up, the cloud covered it. From evening till morning, the cloud above the tabernacle looked like fire. That is how it continued to be. The cloud covered it, and at night it looked like fire. When the cloud lifted from above the tent, the Israelites re-embarked. However, wherever the cloud settled, the Israelites encamped. At the Lord's command, the Israelites re-embarked, and at his command, they encamped. As long as the cloud stayed over the tabernacle, they remained in camp. When the cloud remained over the tabernacle a long time, the Israelites obeyed the Lord's order and did not re-embark. Sometimes the cloud was over the tabernacle only a few days. At the Lord's command, they would encamp, and then at his command, they would re-embark. Sometimes the cloud stayed only from evening till morning, and when it lifted in the morning, they re-embarked. Whether by day or by night, whenever the cloud lifted, they re-embarked. Whether the cloud stayed over the tabernacle for 2 days or a month or a year, the Israelites would remain in camp and not re-embark. But when it lifted, they would re-embark. At the Lord's command, they encamped, and at the Lord's command, they re-embarked. They obeyed the Lord's order in accordance with his command through Moses. Now, the history of the tabernacle after the children of Israel crossed the Jordan River into the Promised Land sort of trails off. Immediately after entering the Promised Land, Joshua set up the tabernacle at Gilgal, and then again at Shechem. Then, according to Joshua 18, the tabernacle was established at Shiloh, and according to Talmudic sources, it remained there for 369 years. When the people of Israel, according to 1 Samuel 4, removed the Ark of the Covenant from the tabernacle and took it into battle with them against the Philistines. After that, it would seem that the tabernacle was disassembled, at least for a while, because when the Ark of the Covenant was recovered from the Philistines 7 months later, according to 1 Samuel 6 and 7, it was not returned to the tabernacle, but was taken to Abinadab's house in Kiriath Jearim. And it appears that it wasn't placed back into the tabernacle until the tabernacle was reassembled sometime later at Gibeon, according to 1 Chronicles 16:39. Then, for reasons unknown, according to 2 Samuel 6, the Ark of the Covenant was moved to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, where it stayed for a short time before David had it moved to Jerusalem. After that, the tabernacle of Moses disappears from the pages of Scripture. But the Ark of the Covenant doesn't. And I find this interesting because though the tabernacle went by the wayside, probably due simply to wear and tear, it was, after all, made mostly of wood and fabric and badger skins and dolphin skins, and it was hundreds of years old. The Ark of the Covenant remained intact, however. And I think that there are probably at least two reasons for that. First, because though the Ark of the Covenant was made of wood, the wood of which it was made was gilded. That is, it was covered with hammered gold. And second, and more importantly for today's lesson, because the space above the lid of the Ark of the Covenant between the two cherubs was the mercy seat, which was the throne of God within the tabernacle. Indeed, Numbers 7:89 tells us that whenever Moses would go into the national tabernacle to speak with the Lord, the voice that spoke to him seemed to be coming from a point just above the mercy seat, atop the ark of the elements of the covenant, between the two cherubs. So that's where Moses would direct his words. So it doesn't come as a surprise to me that the Ark of the Covenant should have more permanent staying power and be more resistant to the elements than the tabernacle itself, because the presence of God rested directly and specifically on the Ark of the Covenant. And it seems that the presence of God remained with the Ark of the Covenant even when it was removed from the tabernacle, And that makes sense to me because it wasn't the tabernacle that made the Ark of the Covenant holy, but the Ark of the Covenant that made the tabernacle holy. That's why only the high priest could enter into the Holy of Holies, not just because it was the inner sanctum of the tabernacle, but because it was the place where the Ark of the Covenant was. And it was the location on earth where God resided. And the record of Scripture clearly indicates that God went wherever the Ark of the Covenant went, which is why David wanted the Ark to be brought to Jerusalem in the first place. Because just as surely as it was God's desire to dwell in the midst of his people, it was also David's desire that God should dwell in the midst of his people. Now, we all know the history of how it was that God didn't allow David to build a temple for him, but he did allow Solomon to do so. As we read in 2 Samuel 7, 12 through 13, the Lord said to David, "When your days are over, and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." And when Solomon did build the temple and moved the Ark of the Covenant into it, God took up residence in the temple, just as he had taken up residence in the tabernacle. As we read in 2 Chronicles chapters 6 and 7, "Then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in front of the whole assembly of Israel and spread out his hand and said, 'And now, Lord, the God of Israel, let your word that you promised your servant David come true. But will God really dwell on earth with humans? The heavens, even the highest heavens, cannot contain you. How much less this temple that I have built? Yet, Lord my God, give attention to your servant's prayer and his plea for mercy. Hear the cry and the prayer that your servant is praying in your presence. May your eyes be opened toward the temple day and night, this place of which you said you would put your name there. May you hear the prayer your servant prays toward this place. Hear the supplications of your servant and of your people Israel when they pray toward this place. Hear from heaven, your dwelling place, and when you hear, forgive." When Solomon finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices he had offered, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. And the priests could not enter the temple of the Lord because the glory of the Lord filled it. And I find this interesting because we know that the temple was not God's idea, it was David's idea. Nevertheless, God did inhabit the temple. But why? Why did God inhabit the place made for him by Abraham? Why did God inhabit the place made for him by Moses? Why did God inhabit the place made for him by Solomon? Well, the only answer in Scripture that I'm aware of to this question is because God wanted to be close to his people, not just figuratively close, but literally close, physically close to them. As we read earlier from Exodus 26, 45 through 46, "And I will dwell among the children of Israel and will be their God, and they shall know that I am the Lord their God that brought them forth out of the land of Egypt, that I may dwell among them. For I am the Lord their God." And that begs the question, how does this make sense What is it that's so important about proximity? Why does it matter where God is spatially, as that relates to where we are spatially? And how does any of that tie in with the series of lessons we're currently in? What does any of that have to do with the parable of the unjust steward? How do these things go together? And why does God want to be physically close to his people? Come back next week, and I'll tell you. That's my lesson for today.